So after the 2008 crisis, Congress put the Fed in charge of supervising the biggest banks and created a new position, this vice chair for supervision, that was supposed to lead that effort. That means if you're confirmed to this position, Mr. Quarles, you will have more influence than any other person over the regulation of the big banks. Now, given that enormous power, the number one thing we need from the Fed's vice chair for supervision is a demonstrated willingness to stand up to the interests of the big banks that threaten the financial institutions. But when I look at your 30-year career spinning through the revolving door of the private sector, Mr. Quarles, I just don't see it. You've got 15 years representing big banks at a New York law firm, working on some of the mergers that created the too-big-to-fail banks that we have today. You have 2 stints at the Treasury Department, including shortly before the 2008 crisis, where you insisted that the banks were well-capitalized enough to survive a housing downturn. Turns out they weren't. And more than a decade in private equity and investment management, where you've argued repeatedly for weaker rules for the biggest banks. So that's not a track record that should give Americans a whole lot of confidence in you. But what I want to do is try to look ahead on this. The big banks and financial firms have a lobbying organization called the Financial Services Roundtable, or FSR, and it has no community bank members. It's purely the big guys. FSR recently submitted a 124-page wish list of financial rule rollbacks for the Treasury Department. So I want to go through some of these and see how your views line up with the views of the big banks. So first one here, FSR would like to see the stress test relaxed for the Fed and give its stress test models to the banks before the actual test. They want to see the test ahead of time. Do you support those changes?
Well, not having read the FSR's report, I don't know all of the
Wait,
details
let me get this straight. You've been nominated to be the head of Fed supervision, and you haven't read this from the FSR?
I have not read that report.
Okay, so we'll ask the question then more generally. Do you think that stress test standards need to be relaxed and the banks need to see them in advance?
I think that transparency around the content of the test with the public in general, which would include the regulated entities.
So they ought to be able to see the tests in advance?
I believe that that
and you think they ought to be relaxed?
Of regulation. I don't have a view as to whether they ought to be relaxed, in part because I am not, because of the lack of transparency, I'm not perfectly familiar with all of the content of the test.
Okay, so you think they ought to see the test in advance is just what they're asking for, and you don't have an opinion on whether or not they ought to be weakened. How about capital? FSR would like a bunch of changes to the calculation of how capital and leverage requirements that would have the effect of lowering, all of which would have the effect of lowering these standards. Do you believe that capital and leverage standards should be lowered?
I don't have a view as to whether they should be higher or lower. I do think that more can be done to ensure that in setting the capital for the full range of institutions in the system, that we can be more sensitive to the character of each institution in determining.
So you think it should be lowered for some but raised for others?
Again, in advance of the analysis, I couldn't tell you.
So you don't have an opinion on that. What about the Volcker Rule, which prohibits the banks from making risky bets with their own money? FSR wants to cut the rule back so that the banks